of course, from so simple a beginning refers to the last paragraph of The Origin of Species. Darwin says, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. So we're going to take, I don't know, about a 10,000 foot view, a million foot view, I think, of this to follow up. So in the diversity of life, these are just some of the major categories. You are on this tiny little branch here, right between the fungi and the slime molds. And even that is part of a larger grouping, and you can already see some of these connections going back and forth. It's not the clear-cut tree of life that Darwin had envisioned, but that's okay. What we want to know, of course, how did it happen? When did these various events happen? How much can we actually know? And actually, it's quite a lot. As Glenn mentioned last time, our 8 planets are basically in place by about 4.5 billion years ago. And the moon forms shortly thereafter in a collision with a planetoid a putative planetoid called Theia. The early Earth, the first eon called the Hadean, the Earth starts off molten, the surface cools to form a crust. All of this, as Glenn mentioned last time. There's continuing bombardment as more material accretes to the Earth. The surface cools. You get the crust, it cools more and you get more crust. You get tectonic plates starting that are moved about by the convection currents. You get lots of volcanoes. A lot of things are going on. You also get comets, asteroids, things hurtled in from space, some of which have a lot of water. This, combined with the outgassing of water from inside the Earth, forms the oceans very early on. You can see that although life starts pretty much as early as it possibly can on here, the part that we tend to be interested in is sort of this last bit here with us and our closest relatives. So we're going to talk a little bit about these parts as well today, since, again, this is the overview. Shortly after the Earth cools enough to have a crust, you find chemical traces of biomolecules. By 3.8, you find fossil cells. By 3.6 billion years ago, you have stromatolites, large structures caused by life. These substances, these biomolecules, you can think of them as something produced by living organisms. So it could include proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, small molecules, large molecules. There are just 6 elements that make up most of them. And that's carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and to a lesser extent, phosphorus and sulfur. But of course, the question is, how do you get the earliest biogenic substances, which, since they presumably did not come from living things to begin with? And the answer, they came from space, but not as little green men. How do we know they came from space? Well, there are a number of different lines of evidence. One is, this is the Orion Nebula, and in 2010, it was observed with an instrument called a heterodyne spectrometer. And of course, as molecules vibrate and rotate, they give off radio waves. And the particular frequency of those is specific to each element and to each molecule. It gives a kind of a fingerprint of the molecule. And just in this one study of Orion, there were lots of biogenic molecules, lots of organic molecules, including things like formaldehyde and methanol, various molecules that you would expect to see if life were there, but we're saying it doesn't indicate life. But these are the sorts of things that life is made up of that come in from outer space. Also, lab research. How do you get biomolecules from non-biogenic sources? Here's some folks from NASA Ames astrochemistry group, and they've frozen a methane and ammonia-rich ices, basically. They've frozen these things and bombarded them by UV radiation, and you get more and more complex molecules forming, the sorts of molecules that you find in living things. So it seems as though it's not quite as difficult a step to take, or as chancy a step to take, as one might initially have thought. To an overview of the system, then you've got stars dying, primary stars dying and ejecting their contents, secondary stars forming. You get stars and planets forming, and various things rain down onto the surface of the Earth in the form of the comets, dust particles, cosmic dust, asteroids, meteorites, that sort of thing. They have various combinations of more and less complex molecules. On the Earth, you combine them with things going on such as hydrothermal vents, outgassing through volcanoes, Miller-Urey type syntheses where you've got lightning and you know, high energy events. The various ways that the oceans are split up, small pools in some places, large bodies in others, and this sort of constant flux leads to more and more complex molecules being formed. So the question arises, well, then if we have all this complexity, what counts as life and what doesn't? And it's a question on which opinions differ. But certainly we can regard life as coming from nebulae in some manner, right? They are evolving, life is evolving organic reactions of various kinds. You have some kind of metabolism that goes on. There's some kind of replicator, and that's an important element, some kind of genetic type system. The simplest viri have around 8 genes. The simplest bacteria have around 200. Of course, we have 30,000, 30 million, 30,000, right? 30 million, yeah, 30 million. Stand up here, good. NASA defines life as a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. The thing is that natural selection acts even on systems that we would call prebiotic. It's already happening in chemical systems, so that's even maybe not quite as good a definition as one might like. And to think about that for a minute, you can think about how these complex pathways form, just in the general sense that you have individual parts. So these could be smaller molecules, simpler molecules, structures of various kinds, crystals. They combine in different ways. And these are somewhat different elements than, and by elements I don't mean chemical elements, but different parts of larger structures. And they come together, and these things were useful on their own in various ways. These are useful in other ways. And when you get a larger molecule like this, it takes on yet more functions. And so you can see this as not a sudden appearance of life, but as a gradual buildup of simpler things into more complex things that take on emergent functions. And so if you ask the question, what is the jump? What happened at the jump to life? You can think of it more as a hop into what Darwin called a warm little pond that he imagined, right? And so in the warm little pond, you have various things floating around. Today, life is built on a nucleic acid foundation, which presumably it always has in some manner since it's been called life. The replicator of genetic information is RNA. A few chemical tweaks to simpler precursors, simpler nucleic acids, probably gave a ribose or a pre-ribose the capacity to replicate itself. And once it began making copies, it continued making copies. It just turns right over, and you get more copies, and they start interacting with other things in the pond, such as bubbles. This is a liposome. It's a fatty acid bubble that forms spontaneously. We could do it right here. It forms naturally. There are also clay bubbles that form naturally, and those are another possibility for what contained this replicating element of the system. If you get the replicator inside this, it's protected from outside intervention and is sort of safer for replication. When these things get too big, they would burst. And since the replicator is dividing inside, some of the strand goes with one and some strand goes with the other, and eventually you get something like division of protocells. Selection evidently favored stronger membranes, and so you get a more resilient membrane around this protocell. And you get more and more sophisticated capabilities. And at some point, you'd want to call this thing that's replicating its inside and turning things over in a proto-metabolic way and dividing into two containers, you'd want to say, well, that's pretty much life. And exactly where you draw that line depends on the individual researcher, but it seems that in systems where RNA catalysts were translating themselves into a different kind of catalyst, so an enzyme, an amino acid chain, that was a more resilient system. And so those tended to take over. They seemed to be favored by selection, and you got RNA-based organisms, if you want to call them at this point, that translate into amino acid-based systems that then do the work of the cell. And along the way, you get DNA, which is kind of a library. So you have the RNA, and it's producing the proteins and enzymes. And they're making sort of a library of this to the side, so that DNA is kind of like a library book. And what the ribosome does is it brings it in and it makes a copy, like a photocopy at a library. And then you can go on and use that photocopy for a lot of things. But DNA by itself, it just sits there, basically, like the book. It doesn't do something exciting until someone interacts with it. That someone or something being the ribosomes. At this point, I think you'd want to call it life by anyone's definition. So this is all in the first less than 1 billion years on Earth. By 3.8 billion years, you clearly have things that anyone would call bacteria, basically. And by 3.6, they're forming colonies and we have stromatolite fossils from the time, huge algal mats that trap various sediment, and pretty much life as we know it, and they're still with us. Here are little cyanobacteria looking quite a bit like that lipid bubble with goo inside.
In one of the early slides, you had a color rendition of the 6 components, with sulfur in red being, from the slide, the largest of the components. That surprised me.
The point is not that they're in the same proportions that we have in life. It's that they exist out there, they come down here, and that's what life is made from. So the proportions are undoubtedly quite different in the Orion Nebula than they are in living organisms, but it's the same elements and the same. Some of the larger molecules are already made there in Orion and in any other nebula.
We're still being bombarded by asteroids, meteors. How has that changed life on Earth as it is?
So early on, of course, there were a lot more bombardments because, as Glenn mentioned last time, you have this sort of planetary disk, and the planets form out of it, and they're continuing to pick up material as we go along. Just as we saw Clyde Simpson's talk at the Happy Dog last night. He said there's 100 tons of meteorites hit the Earth every day. And the largest category, I guess, of asteroids are ones that are rich in carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, the sorts of things that we need. So basically, there's no shortage of raw material, is sort of the point. There's nothing here that's utterly unique in any way. Everything that's found on Earth is found, at least the components of it, are found everywhere throughout the universe.
Is there any evidence of non-carbon-based life, like silicon-based life, that we know of in the universe, and also the UV changed the methane. Did we ever look at infrared, or was it just at UV, or UV in higher frequencies?
I think people have looked at just about anything you can imagine. And it's interesting because the Miller-Urey experiment, the one that was publicized in the first publication, that sort of thing, was a very specific one, and it had particular proportions of methane and other things. But actually they had tons of these with different combinations and different things going into them. I don't know if infrared was one, but I would be surprised if it wasn't something that they thought of. And not too long ago, maybe within the past 10 years, a whole closet full of these experiments that were still sort of ongoing were discovered in Urey's lab as they were cleaning it out. And you just get more and more complex organic molecules.
Do we only have evidence of carbon-based life?
Yes, we do.
We don't have any silicon-based life?
Right now, we only have evidence of life on Earth.
That's only carbon-based?
Oh, we have only carbon-based life on Earth so far as we know. Nothing, we have not recognized anything on Earth that you would call life that has some other foundation.
Using a lower frequency has not resulted in changes in the methane. I'm just wondering how much energy we have to put in the methane to change it.
That is a very technical question that I'm not really, and also things have moved on since Miller-Urey. I mean, they're enormously complex things that folks are doing. And of course, Miller and Urey didn't get life popping up out of their test tubes, right? What they got was the formation of very complex organic molecules. So I think you probably would not need a very high frequency of that in the methane, but again, it's not my area.
Life is so likely to occur on Earth. That is, that within 1 million years you had real cells that we would identify today. Is there any hint, or why do you think it didn't, as far as we know, originate more than once?
I think that the conditions need to be right. Okay, so among our planets, the only one that can support life as we know it is our planet. So we have only one experiment to look at, and it happened. But there are tons of other planets being discovered all the time, and we can't really track yet what they might have on them. Looking at them with spectrometers, so far there's nothing that suggests that we've discovered life like ours.
I interpreted his question more to the point of how many times life may have started on the planet Earth, not necessarily in the universe. And I would presume that it could have started many, many times at many, many places and eventually merged throughout the planet.
That is the thinking among early life researchers, that you have a sort of not a tree of life with distinct roots going back, but you have this web of roots interlacing, and you have things going back and forth, and bubbles taking parts of different nucleic acids and evolving chemistry from one other bubble and from another bubble here, and they're combining and this sort of thing. So it may be a tree of life, but it starts out with a wide root system in which you have a lot of spontaneous generation of life. However, it did converge on one system that did take over, and we can, I think, with reasonable certainty, trace all of the living organisms back to one particular branch of the root structure, and the others went extinct. Anytime you would have these, once you have something like life like we have that takes energy so readily, it would gobble up any sort of thing like that. So once we have something we would to call life, what does it do? Well, it continues interacting, swapping parts back and forth. You have bacterial cells. They have things called plasmids that they will swap between each other, and so they will exchange genetic material. Some say it's sort of like a protosexual reproductive system. They will send a plasmid out. It'll capture some material from another. This is why antibiotic resistance is such a difficult problem for example, because bacteria will send these plasmids out and will take bits of, they'll sample other bacteria. And so it's not just a sort of straightforward Darwinian way of sorting things out, and you get some that are more resistant to the antibiotic. You have them actually sampling from each other till they get the right thing to overcome it, the right combination to overcome it. And this is proving to be a very difficult issue to overcome, especially very recently. And the systems that produced that are called symbiotic systems. And in many ways, life is a history of symbiosis. So this is an amoeba. And if you think of it in terms of, you can think of it in terms of a symbiosis of various kinds of bacteria-like organisms. So in that manner, even though it's a single cell, a eukaryotic cell, a cell with a nucleus, you can think of it kind of as a superorganism of its own. So today, we can see, again, another line of evidence that this swapping back and forth is sort of the theme of life, is that within eukaryotic cells like ours, you have organelles that have retained their own DNA over billions of years. And it divides, of course, in concert with the rest of the cell. To give an illustration from the other side, again, why do we think these things happened the way that we say they did? It's, again, not a rare thing. You think, oh, that's some weird thing that happened a long time ago, that you had endosymbiosis of bacteria and other things and formed a nucleus. In 1966, a fellow named Quang Zhang, working at the University of Tennessee, he had a colony of amoeba going. And these amoeba got infected by a bacterium, which he called X bacterium. He could not fight it off. They were absolutely swamped by it. Lots and lots of them died. But eventually, after some generations, they livened up again and they seemed fine. And he assumed that they had fought off the bacterium. But as he started looking at them, he found that they were still packed with bacteria, but that they had become symbiotic to the extent that they couldn't survive. Neither organism could survive without the other one. So when he tried to kill off the bacteria in the amoeba died. It had gone from being an infection to being a working part of that individual organism. And he still has descendants of those today, dividing in unison, that sort of thing. So again, the notion that we had of life being this single event, very unlikely, that sort of thing, the processes that produced something like the eukaryotic cell being very rare and surprising, not so much. And just to give another example of how symbiosis of various kinds, including parasitism like this, one possible explanation for sexual reproduction is that the sperm evolved from a parasite. It became parasitic on a single cell, eukaryotic cell, and would sample the genetics of the cell and maybe go away and combine it with some other thing, and that this was the basis for sexual reproduction. And sexual reproduction in this manner has certainly arisen multiple times. So you have protists that do sexual reproduction, you have plants, animals, independent examples of this. Again, looking from the 10,000-foot view, another big event in the history of the Earth was the great oxygen poisoning event, or oxygen event as it's called. Among the talents of these evolving lineages is the capacity to gain energy from the sun and produce, spin off oxygen. Oxygen is toxic. Right? Free radicals in the blood, this sort of thing. We're constantly trying to control the bad effects of oxygen. So around 2.5 billion, you get enough of these that you start getting oxygen released into the atmosphere at a large level. And so as a result, the iron that was around in the ocean gets oxidized and rusts. The Earth rusts, effectively. And you get these beautiful banded iron formations like this one from Ontario of points at which the oxygen wave of oxygen came through that was enough to bond with the iron and produce these beautiful layers. And that set the stage for lots more evolutionary experiments, different directions, different talents, different emerging functions. One of those was multicellularity. And after the free oxygen, between about 2 and 1 billion years ago, you see various kinds of multicellular organisms or colonies evolving. Prominent are algal mats, and we still have these today. Again, all of the things that we're talking about still exist. All the stromatolites, we still have these things. We still have algal mats. We find fossils of them that look very much like that. Now, traditionally, people have drawn a distinction between colonial organisms as multicellular and multicellular organisms that have organs, right, that have different functions within the group. Even in some of these colonies, you'll find parts of the larger colony that specialize in different things. And so again, there's more of a transition than one might think to what we think of as an organism with different traits. And you'll see in various lineages them sort of flirting with the kind of system that we think of as an organism today. Another major event in the history of the Earth, around 1 billion years, you have the formation of a supercontinent Rodinia. The tectonic plates eventually all come around to being in one place. You have this supercontinent. It eventually starts to split up, but perhaps as a result of that, you have an intense ice age, a glaciation. It lasted for a very long time, over 100 million years. It depletes the free oxygen, and you'll find, again, iron-banded formations from this period as things start to melt and oxygen is released again. So it's an interesting way that the history of the Earth is woven together of a bunch of different things that we think of as somewhat separate. Shortly thereafter, you have the emergence of very interesting multicellular life. Some things with hard parts, some things with clear organs. These creatures are often called vendobionts, and Dolph Zeilacher has proposed a new kingdom-level distinction for these, vendozoan. In his opinion, these are neither plants nor animals, but yet another independent experiment in multicellularity, as he puts it. You might think that this looks a little like a trilobite, and that would be the head. But when you look at it in detail, these are not radiating segments. They actually cross over. They're not at all the sorts of things that we're familiar with. They're not segments. These are kind of woven creatures. Some of them are quite large. Some of them are this long. And so rather than having the sorts of organs that we have that can produce a sort of a round-bodied thing, these have organs that are able to get their, make their living by osmosis and diffusion primarily. And yet they have different tissue types, things like that. This one here is one of the more round-bodied kind. But you can see that it has 2 layers. And inside there is the energy-making part. They lived until, and this is something that people don't always, a lot of these come from the Ediacaran fauna in Australia and South Africa. A lot of folks think that these needed to die off before modern organisms could come in. In fact, it's not the case. These lived till at least 550 million years ago, and perhaps as recently as 500 million years ago. We don't know if they were killed off by animals, as they came in, but if they were, it certainly took a long time to have effect. So it's more likely that these were killed off by some kind of overall climate change or this sort of thing, and were not outcompeted by our ancestors. Famously, around 542 million years ago, you have the Cambrian explosion. Now, prior to the Cambrian explosion, you had elements of life as we know it. Perhaps as much as 1 billion years ago, you have embryos of things related to sponges, or probably related to sponges. You have, concurrent with the Ediacaran vendibionts, you have what's called the small shelly fauna, which definitely seems to be related to us. The Cambrian explosion is the beginning of the Phanerozoic Eon, so sort of the eon of life. The modern phyla of animals appear. A whole bunch of other phyla also appear, but go extinct by the end of the Cambrian, or certainly into the Ordovician, the next time period. The Phanerozoic is divided into 3 eons: the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. So old life, middle life, and recent life. In the Cambrian explosion, in the Cambrian period, you get the familiar animal phyla, such as brachiopods, which are still living. A lot of them went extinct, but some of them are still around. Some people actually eat brachiopods. They're not very good. Trilobites, echinoderms, sea stars, these sorts of things. Urchins. Chordates, our own branch. Right? Now, the early chordates, you don't find fish in the Cambrian. You find something more like tunicates or modern Amphioxus, if you're familiar with that. But very quickly into the Ordovician and Silurian, you start getting fish. Fish more like this, rather than this, which is very recent. As I say, some of the phyla don't continue. For example, this organism is called Opabinia, and it is related to us, but it has 5 eyes. It is bilaterally symmetrical, and it has a central nozzle. Looks like a vacuum cleaner. And it would scoop up sediment, presumably, and filter it through and absorb it that way. So you can see that a lot of the sort of body designs that were possible, given the genetic underpinning of our, our historical genetic underpinning, a lot of those manifestations didn't continue. Whether ours, and the ones we're familiar with, continued for selective reasons is not clear. It could just be that in a system, only some critters are going to survive, and there's a large chance element of it. It's hard to say. I have not heard any good arguments for why this, having established itself at good size, would be bad enough to go extinct. Right? I think it's more likely chance on that. Other Paleozoic events, you have the invasion of land by plants. People think always, oh, land, life coming out on the land, they think of our ancestors, right, crawling out. Well, they crawled out, what were they going to eat? Plants were there first, insects were there first, lots of things were there before our ancestors were, before tetrapods. But we did also get tetrapods around 380 million years ago. This is Tiktaalik, the most recent exciting fossil, and its discoverer says that one of the most important things about it, it has a neck. Right? And you wouldn't think, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, you have somewhat earlier what are sometimes called fish with figures, called acanthostegids. Fish that were living among the weeds at the bottom in the lower, low water areas of freshwater streams and lakes. And they would move around. They had actually digits that they helped clear the way with. They were not on land at all, but they were fish with fingers. Well, by the time you get Tiktaalik, this particular lineage, you have a neck and you have a shoulder girdle. You have a number of other features that indicate that this creature was not just doing this, but coming up on land and doing various things and able to move around, and that's the specific lineage. Interestingly also, there are some fossils that have not just 5 fingers, but 6, 7, even 8 digits. And probably this sort of invasion of the land happened in parallel in many different places, but we're descended from one particular incursion. In the end of the Paleozoic is the Permian Extinction, the largest mass extinction in the history of the Earth, so far as we know. And 95% of marine invertebrate species go extinct. On land, it's devastating as well. If you look at areas where sediment was being deposited, you'll see this much sediment with nothing in it, no burrows, nothing. That was so profound. We don't know why. It may well have been some kind of extraterrestrial impact. There are various ideas about that. Another important Mesozoic event, the formation and then breakup of supercontinent Pangaea, which is more familiar to us than Rodinia. And from that, you can still track how things were put together, how the different tectonic plates came together. Famously as well, the Mesozoic, the evolution of archosaurs, dinosaurs, and birds. And the evolution of mammals alongside them. And then their extinction in the third largest mass extinction event, the Cretaceous Tertiary, or sometimes called Cretaceous Paleogene. This one, and here is the actual spot at which you have the changeover, the extinction event. It is really well established that this is due to an extraterrestrial impact of an asteroid, although Clyde Simpson wants to say it's a comet. It might have been a comet. Anyway, we have the smoking gun in the form of a crater just off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula with clear, again, chemical signatures. And all over the Earth, you have a layer that's very high in uridium and other elements that came from space, and they track precisely to this impact. So that is the crater. It's not just an example of one. That is associated with the extinction of the dinosaurs, the trilobites, I'm sorry, the, not nautiloids, but anyway, lots and lots of creatures. Interestingly, some of the single-celled organisms that came through, ocean organisms that came through, were ones that would hibernate. So they were parts from the poles, whereas the ones in the equatorial regions did not make it through, things like diatoms. So it's again, an indication that it was this cloud of dust that circled the Earth that blocked out light that caused the extinction.
I need to ask about the neck. Is it just that you don't need a neck in water, or a neck's required on land?
It's required on land to do certain things. So if Acanthostega had come out on land, probably puddles dried up and these things happened, they would be able to get around a bit, but they don't really have, it's the whole shoulder girdle, really. That's the thing. They could really, they're flat like this, right? They don't have anything to support. They might crawl around, but they wouldn't be able to look up, look around, do things, interact. It would be hard to eat food because of the difference between air and, being in water and being in air. So it's an indication that here's a creature that was going up on land, as well as certainly being in the water as well. A little like a newt today. It's hard for people, they think, oh, well, how could a fish go up on land? Well, newts do it all the time, right? They start as tadpole-like things, and they end up having legs and tails, and they spend a lot of time on the land and a lot of time in the water. It's not a barrier to them the way it is that we think about it.
It also took a long time for the oxygen to build up. For this explosion to occur, you need to have energy. You need to have multicellular organisms, complicated. And it took a long time to build oxygen into the atmosphere, to change it over from the reducing atmosphere to the oxidizing atmosphere. And so for the first 2.5 billion years, you had either no oxygen or maybe 1/10, at the maximum 1/10 the current atmospheric level. And it wasn't until just the beginning of the Phanerozoic that you started seeing the oxygen level go up to its peak in the Cambrian.
After the glaciation finally melted off. To look just a little bit more at extinction, one question is, why do you have mass extinctions? Now you can see with an asteroid impact or something like that, it's going to change the rules of, by which organisms function. So the diatoms that were in colder regions that would hibernate effectively, they got through the mass extinction where the others did not. Things like that. So you can think of that as being different rules. Natural selection is not sort of failing. It's all of the basis for selection has had the rug pulled out from under it. And this is opposed to the previous expectation among a lot of evolutionary biologists, and especially paleontologists, that periods of mass extinction were the result of, if you will, turning up the gain on an instrument, right? So you would have a background extinction level, and that sometimes you would just have a bit more of that. Thinking today is coming around to the expectation that when you have a mass extinction, these are extinction levels, right? Extinction, you've got a background level, extinction, 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 that something else has intervened there to sort of change the rules. That it's not that. For a while, especially in German evolutionary biological thinking, the expectation was that lineages of organisms, evolving clades as we call them, would have senescence. They would get too old to produce more diversity, and they would simply die out on their own. And that you would have originations, and diversity would build up, and then you would have it all come crashing down. So we think now that the different rules approach is the best explanation for why you have mass extinctions. Earth history is frequently divided by mass extinctions, the points at which I mentioned the end Permian extinction, that's the end of the Paleozoic. The end Mesozoic extinction, the KT is the end of that. This slide has a lot of information on it, but I'll just draw attention. The green parts are well-resolved genera. So this is really very good data. Right? The others, it's not clear, but there's a lot more data, and it follows pretty much the same pattern, and so that's suggestive. The extinction events are here, the big 5 mass extinctions there. We do seem to have an increase in biodiversity going on since the Cretaceous and Cretaceous extinction, and it's not clear exactly what that's due to. The more cynical say that it's just that as things are, more similar to us, we tend to split them into different, categories more, and so that it may be an effect of that. But there is another explanation which has to do with different tissue types. Folks have long wanted to see some kind of increase in complexity over evolutionary time, and everything that's been suggested ends up really not being that that explanatory. But what you have had is a net increase in different kinds of tissues. And once you get different kinds of tissues, you get interactions among them. And so and these are some of the things that, that Peter was saying. As you get these systems more and more set in, you have possibilities for more and more complex interactions and different things to evolve. So that may be the explanation there. But they also do have a lot of unresolved genera there that are in question. But one question, of course, is, are we about to have another mass extinction, and is it man-made? I think that's a really different kind of mass extinction than we've had in the past, although you can think of it as a sort of a different rules thing. Certainly, they didn't have, possums didn't have to deal with being run over back in the early Cenozoic. So, and this leads to an issue that I find very interesting. What is macroevolution? And people define it different ways. My definition is that it is the formation of new species and higher taxa, the origin of evolutionary novelties, and patterns of evolution and extinction. So that everything we've talked about thus far is macroevolution, even though we haven't really talked about the origin of species per se. And we won't be talking about the origin of species particularly. Again, that would be another talk that we would love to have in our series. You can think of a couple different kinds of formation of higher taxa. One is you get new species or new genera, you get an evolution radiation. Right? And so if you think about Darwin's finches, you have a bunch of these different little guys, but they're all sort of much of a muchness. Right? You've got this kind of a spread of diversity. You have radiations, evolutionary radiations in all groups of organisms, these anemone. And one question, okay, if genetic systems are fairly simple in essence, how do they generate all this diversity, right? And thinking about recruitment of different genes to different tasks, the kind of tissue type evolution, that sort of thing, it's all sort of variations on a theme, right? And so you get variations on bats. Most of us don't spend much time looking at the faces of bats. They're really amazing, these different ways to trap sound waves, basically. Evolutionary radiation of antelopes. Bats, antelopes, and rodents have more species, are the lineages with the most species among mammals. A lot of the antelopes are identifiable by their patterns of their horns. And members of those species recognize those horn patterns and will breed with those and not with other animals that look pretty much the same to us, but have different, slightly different shapes to their horns. And so you get a lot of elements that cause a radiation in this group. Frogs, of course, we've had a major radiation of frogs just in the past couple tens of thousands of years, couple dozen thousand years. Lots of different things. And of course, hummingbirds of all the different kinds. We only have a few here in North America, but amazing to see. So the question is, okay, you've got radiations and radiations and radiations. What about new kinds of organisms? Darwin said that he's going to not just do what Lamarck did with explaining, the origin of new species or genera, but he's going to explain fundamentally new types of organisms. And those would fall under evolutionary novelties. So if you look at things like these salamanders, they look quite different from one another. But when you lay them out like this, they look rather similar to each other, at least when you compare to something that would be a real novelty, like this guy. This kind of a, goat boy, half-man thing. We can come up with things in our imagination, lots and lots of morphologies that simply don't exist in nature. And why do we get this and not this? And that goes, is a fundamentally deep question about what is macroevolution, what constrains it, as well as allows it to create diversity. And just to go through a bit of an example, here's an animal. And in its young form, its skull has that shape. As it gets a bit bigger, it takes that shape. And as an adult, it takes that shape. So the jaw grows much more than the back of the skull. And these are, of course, chimpanzees. And the Naif, a naturalist, remarks, of all animal pictures known to me, this is the most manlike, is this baby chimp. And you can see how that corresponds to sort of between these two phases of development. Still very upright, lots of features that are similar to us. And the adult is quite different. And so even without fossils, it might lead you to think, where should I look for? What would I expect to find in the fossil record? And one thing that you might look for is to think about the developmental sequence. Here's a baby human, really quite similar to the baby chimp. We do have a larger brain, we have a little bit smaller face, but strikingly similar. And we get only this far in development. We don't get the elongated, right? So you might think, well, if we're looking for something that's split between the chimp and our lineage, you might expect something like this, more like this, to be on the line headed toward us. And indeed, in 1925, Raymond Dart found something that looked very like that. Very like that. This is the Tong child, Australopithecus africanus. He used to pay miners who were working in the breccia mines to bring him chunks of breccia that had lots of fossils in it. And he happened to get the block that contained this in on a day that his best friend was being married at Dart's house, right, in the garden. And one of the miners brought him this chunk, and all you could see was this part here at the base of the skull. And Dart was so excited just by seeing that part that he spent all afternoon working on it and never went out to the wedding that was in his own garden. And what he saw on that was that you had this rather ape-like face, baby ape-like face, but that under here, the foramen magnum, the hole that the spinal cord comes through, showed that this was straight up and down and not coming out the back as it would in a chimp, which says to him that he has a bipedal walker, just from the base of the skull. And indeed, there are lots and lots of other features that once he got this prepared, and of course lots and lots of others were found, he was able to, to study. And of course, this ran counter to the view in England at the time of what to expect from a human ancestor. The adult form is a little bit more, has a bit more of a projecting face. This is a relative, it's not africanus, but it's similar. There, as those of you that went to the Leakey Symposium know, there are a lot of different human relatives once you get into bipedality. But basically, it stays that form. We know they were bipedal, not just from their anatomical forms, but because we have direct evidence from footprints, fossil footprints, 2 million-year-old fossil footprints at Laetoli. 3 million-year-old fossil footprints at Laetoli. So again, we have the theme in evolutionary biology of multiple lines of evidence that converge to tell one story. And the more lines of evidence that converge to tell that story, the more robust we think the conclusion is. So you do have evolutionary novelties, but they don't come in the form of goat boys. They come in the form largely of variations along already established developmental sequences. So you may have evolutionary novelties, but every novelty is balanced out by 10 or even 100 variation on a theme, evolutionary adaptation, radiations. So, and after we got going along this trajectory, at some point, somewhere, something went terribly wrong. So says Michael Sorts. So that brings us up to today. Thank you very much.